I can't believe that we've reached episode 300 together. I have learned loads along the way and made some mistakes too. So in this episode, I wanted to share 300 tips from 300 episodes. Okay, only joking, but I am going to provide you with 3 big benefits, 3 mistakes I've made, and 3 tips for embarking on a B2B podcast. Keep listening to find out more. You're listening to the Content 10x podcast, where it's all about content repurposing. I'm Amy Woods, and I'm here to help you maximize your content and find smart ways to get your message in front of more of the right people, whilst also saving time. Let's get started. Hello and welcome to the Content 10x podcast. I'm Amy Woods, the founder of Content 10x and your host for this episode. Thanks for tuning in to this very special landmark episode since it's episode 300. It feels amazing to have reached this milestone, and I wanted to give you, my listeners, a shout out for your support and input over the years. It's been invaluable, and it's really helped make the Content 10x podcast community what it is today. Now, as you'll know if you've listened in before, the Content 10x podcast is all about ways that we can maximize and repurpose our content. We're all about finding smart ways to do more with less. Now, a big reason for starting the show way back in 2017 was to practice what I preach. I knew that I needed to create content, and I wanted to embark upon episodic content and then repurpose it, experimenting and learning as I go, and sharing all of those lessons on the podcast and also in the way that we deliver our content repurposing services to our clients. So always improving and putting ourselves in our clients' shoes, learning what works, learning from our mistakes too, and making sure that we just deliver a fantastic service to our clients. So a few key reasons why I started the podcast. In this episode, I'm going to share some of the things that I've learned over 300 episodes. I was going to share 300 lessons from 300 episodes, but that would just get ridiculous, wouldn't it? Well, that would be a very long episode. I think I would lose people after about the 100th lesson, I guess. So instead, I'm going to share 3 benefits of the podcast that we have seen. There are so many benefits, but I'll share 3 in particular. Also, 3 mistakes to avoid. Yep, we all make mistakes, and I'm not immune from that, that's for sure. And 3 tips for embarking on a B2B podcast. But before I get to the main content, just a shout out to our Content 10x Toolkit. This fantastic online resource is made up of checklists, video tutorials, and step-by-step guides on how to repurpose and maximize your content. Whether it's videos, a podcast, or written content, plus it takes you through launching your own podcast in 2 weeks. If I inspire you in this episode to launch a B2B podcast, then this might be just what you need. It's 100% updated and ready for you. It's on our website. Just go to content10x.com/toolkit. Okay, so starting with the 3 benefits. Number 1 is you learn as you create. So embarking on a podcast really does help you to develop your expertise. It's really helped me to learn and develop my point of view. Now, I started a weekly podcast on content repurposing, wondering how long I could keep it going. I was asking myself, will I run out of ideas after about 20 episodes? And I really didn't know, but I just went ahead with it anyway. And here I am at episode 300, and I've still got lots to say. I've become a much deeper expert because I've had the podcast. I do lots of research for my episodes. I test things. I also interview experts. And this all leads into learning. You never stop learning with the podcast. And I'm sure it's the same with other forms of episodic type content as well. People who do weekly YouTube videos or webinars or that kind of content. It really does just help you to keep on learning and developing your expertise. Number 2 is you become a better communicator. I think that you become better at communicating your views and expressing yourself when you have a podcast. I've become better at speaking, my communication style has developed, and I've recorded a lot of podcast episodes for video too, which means I've had to become better at being on camera. And honestly, I never thought I'd be able to hop in front of a camera and record video content, never mind then go and share it with the whole world on social media and other platforms. But having a podcast has forced me to do this, and I think that's for the good. I've developed how to express my views on my own for all of the solo episodes that I've created, and I've become better at asking questions and listening when I record my guest episodes. This has made me a far better guest on other people's podcasts and webinars and content generally. And the comm skills that I've developed from being a podcaster, I think extend beyond content too, just to everyday life. And number 3, it's impossible for me not to say so I'm sorry for being predictable, but it's the repurposing potential. The fact that it's not just a podcast, it's a blog post, it's a YouTube video, it's a handful of social media videos, it's a LinkedIn carousel, an infographic, the list goes on. And if you can be consistent with the top of the content waterfall, the podcast episodes, and if you can be consistent with the top of the content waterfall, so with the podcast episodes, and you have the systems and processes in place, then the rest of the content consistently gets created as well. Now, because I was predictable with that benefit, I'll do a 3.5 as well, which is that because you are being consistent with your podcast and all the repurposed content that comes from it, it helps you become known as an expert, and that leads to more opportunities. I've spoken on stages around the world, I've written a book, my team and I have had the chance to work with interesting and inspiring clients through the podcast too. The content opens so many doors. You should check out our podcast episode and blog post called 7 Reasons Why You Should Create Episodic Content. That's episode 171, so that can be found at content10x.com/171. The 7 reasons are all really good benefits of having a show like a weekly podcast, so go check that out too. Okay, so 3 mistakes that I've made for you to avoid. Number 1, don't get complacent with your tech checks and fail to do all the checks that you should do for every episode. For example, episode 262 of the Content 10x podcast, a fantastic episode that I recorded with Robert Rose, and I was devastated when I realised I'd messed up the record setting and only recorded the audio and not the video. 262 episodes in, you'd think I'd know what I'm doing by now, but yet I made a silly mistake. A great episode all the same, but we missed out on some video content. So be as diligent in episode 300 as in episode 1 with your tech checks and never get complacent. Number 2, so talking of video interviews and guests. If you interview guests, make sure that they are set up correctly too. Give them instructions and advice beforehand on having headphones, a mic, lighting, think about their background. These things don't go without saying. Some people just won't think of it, and that's absolutely fine. It might be the first time that they've ever been on a podcast or a video interview. I've made the mistake of perhaps not fully briefing people at first. I've had people turn up sat in their car, in busy offices with background noise, with no mic, with no headphones. Sort all of this out beforehand and be just really clear. A mistake I made was not being slick with my guest briefing process at first. And also, be sure to tell them if it's video or audio only. They need to be prepared. If it's going to be video, you don't want to surprise them when they think they're turning up to an audio-only podcast and then suddenly they discover they're on video and they haven't done the hair and makeup and things like that. So just make sure that you just fully brief guests if you are doing guest interview content. And number 3, don't be afraid to say what you do and promote your own offerings, products, services, lead magnets, etc. on your show. If you have a B2B podcast like me, then one of its main purposes is for brand awareness and thought leadership content. And I'm sure you hope to build your audience and get new leads and sales from it. But I was really focused on not being salesy with my podcast. It was something that I was really worried about. I only wanted to share value. And I did that for so long that I think I forgot, or rather just didn't give myself permission to shout out about what problem we solve at Content 10x and how you can also work with us. You can't have a podcast where you're just going to sell to your audience all the time. No one would listen to that. But you can tell people what you do, and you can find subtle and sometimes not so subtle ways to promote your business or service. I made the mistake of not doing this at all for a very long time. And finally, the 3 tips that I'm going to share with you for having a B2B podcast. So number 1, stay niche or niche. Stay focused and don't deviate. Keep with what your audience subscribed for. These days, the more niche, the better for a B2B podcast. So have your unique angle, know the audience you want, and make sure that you stay focused on that with your show. Number 2, don't try and be everywhere with your repurposing. Facebook, Twitter, Threads, LinkedIn, Pinterest, TikTok, YouTube, Medium, maybe you're looking at Quora, Reddit. It's tempting, but it always goes back to where your audience are and making platform-specific content that resonates. It's better to go all in on a few platforms where you know where your audience are. We have more examples and data to back this up in episode 267, which is called Why Being Everywhere Isn't the Goal of Content Repurposing. So go check that out, content10x.com/267. And finally, number 3, metrics, and focus on the right ones. With a B2B podcast, your podcast downloads aren't going to be the most important metric. Most likely you are not trying to be the next Joe Rogan or Stephen Bartlett with Diary of a CEO. Sure, you have podcast downloads as a metric, of course, but you have the metrics for your repurposed content too. So if your podcast episode also becomes a blog post, well, Google Analytics will show you how many views you got and how many people took action, etc. If your podcast becomes various social media posts, then there's the social media data, the views, the comments, the engagements, etc. on those posts. You might be getting more email subscribers. There's a lot that you can measure. So when you track and measure your content, look at it from a campaign view, getting the data from core and repurposed content and pull it all together, and then you'll be more amazed by the results. I won't go into technical details around this in this episode, but you can find out more in episode 279 called How to Track and Measure Your Content Repurposing. But also don't forget the less quantifiable metrics too. Those metrics like getting invited to speak at events, getting invited onto other people's podcasts, being asked to comment as an expert in an article or an industry publication, maybe being asked to be an expert on a panel. There are many opportunities that arise. And ultimately, if you're really looking at how has your business grown and how many new clients and how many new leads are you getting from your podcast, then you just need to have that really well-rounded view and look at all the different ways that having your podcast and the repurposing that you've done from your podcast and the opportunities that came from your podcast have led to business growth. So there you have it, a summary of some of the things that I've learned, mistakes that I've made, and top tips from 300 podcast episodes. I really hope this has been a helpful and inspiring podcast episode for you. Now, before I go, I just want to mention that you can catch all 300 episodes of our podcast wherever you get your podcasts. We have so many amazing guests and so much advice and lessons learned and tools and tips teaching you how to maximize and repurpose your content. So go check that out. I'm sure there'll be some really, really useful content for you. If you need help with your content repurposing, then we offer a fully done for you content repurposing service here at Content 10x. You can find out more at content10x.com. Now, whether you have webinars, event content, videos, podcasts, research reports, white papers, any form of long-form content, we can help to repurpose, maximize, and distribute your content. Or perhaps you would like to book in for a strategy session and get some help on the overall approach that you are taking with your content marketing and content repurposing. Please do get in touch. As I said, just head to content10x.com/services. Okay, so that's a wrap for this episode. All that's left to say is thank you so much for listening. Happy repurposing, and I'll catch you in the next one.